Bum 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 bum. The Peter Dislike Show. Bum 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 bum. So this year marks 22 years since I quit drinking soda. Soda was the very first thing I cut out of my diet. And one thing I noticed early on in my healthy eating career is that there are really three things that you battle. Two of them are relatively tame. The other one is omnipresent and always very hard to push through. There are three kinds of cravings. Obviously, the most obvious kind of craving is the drug effect, right? Most people call it the taste, but it's really the drug effect, in my opinion. Think about it. If you were addicted to the taste of soda, why don't you just spit it out after you put it in your mouth? Taste it and then spit it out, right? Obviously, if you don't want to do that, chances are there's a drug effect involved, right? But that one goes away really quickly, in my opinion. I've quit many other substances. The drug effect is never the hardest part of it. Number two is obviously the uh, the behavioral aspect of it, right? You get used to the idea that every time I do this, I got to reach for a soda. I distinctly remember the time that I quit drinking soda. It was 2003. The year before that, Kelly Clarkson had competed on American Idol. Obviously, she won. And then that winter, of Christmas Day actually, she went on to compete in World Idol against 10 other idols. And as I was watching that, I kept getting a craving to want to reach for a soda because all that time that I had been watching Kelly Clarkson the year before, I drank soda through that whole season. And so now that I'm seeing her compete internationally, the first I kept wanting to reach for that imaginary soda. But even that, you get through that. I guarantee the season after that, when I was watching American Idol, the thought completely dissipated. Right. Today, I very seldom get an idea that I need to drink soda when I do something. Right. Even when my grandmother passed away, I didn't really think too much about that. Right? It would have to be something really novel that I hadn't touched in the last 22 years. Right. In 22 years, you touch pretty much everything in your life. Right. The one thing that was omnipresent, and I still have to, well, not as much today, but up until 5, 10 years ago, was omnipresent in our society, was the whole social complex of our lives, right? Every time that I would go to a certain event, there was an expectation that you would drink soda. I would argue that's not as bad as it is today compared to 10 years ago, even though, because I was recently at a graduation party and they had all sorts of beverages out there, soda, water, everything else. And the water disappeared a lot faster than the soda. That's not the expectation I got 10 years ago, even. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I was working on my PhD, and there were a lot of social barriers to not drinking soda. Nowadays, you blend right in, right? You could go your whole life without drinking soda, without ever having to make a scene, right? You're probably not going to be stuck in a party where only soda is offered. You're probably not going to sound really off if somebody offers you a soda and you say you don't drink it, right? It's kind of like if somebody offered you a cigarette or a vape and you refused it. You could have probably refused a cigarette 30 years ago and not look very off, right? Even 40 years ago, I would argue, right? It's kind of like that, right? Now, where it drives me nuts is people will make all sorts of excuses to continue their habits, no matter how bizarre it sounds. So, for example, I was 7 years ago, I dated a girl who was studying nursing. Believe it or not, of all things, you would think she would be the one to not make excuses. She told me about the concept of a food desert. Now, believe me, I have spent time in food deserts. I lived in one for a few months during the pandemic. I've traveled to them and behaved like how somebody who might live there would, right? A lot of times it's really what you prioritize, right? A lot of people who live in food deserts have plenty of time to go on social media and do a bunch of other stuff, right? But anyways, I told her, okay, fine. Let's believe that these are the only foods that are available. What if they ate badly, but just ate half as much? And she claimed that it could cause all sorts of malnutrition. Well, you know what? I've never studied nutrition. I'll take her at her word for it. Well, just stop drinking the soda then. Keep everything else constant and don't drink soda. And she thought that could kill some people. I don't know anymore. I have a hard time believing that somebody who keeps their diet constant, with the exception of switching out the soda for water, I have a hard time believing that. I guess if you live somewhere where bottled water or tap water was unsafe for some reason, right? It contained heavy metals. It contained heavy metals, maybe even a few radioisotopes. Yeah, I can kind of see that, right? Short of that, I have a hard time believing that. I really do. But leave a comment if you beg to differ. I was arguing with, well, maybe I shouldn't talk so much about this stuff at work, but one day I was arguing with a colleague about the wisdom of using GLP-1 medications. And I argue, and this is my personal philosophy on that. Do I think they should not be used? Not necessarily. But I think if you eat even a minute amount of refined white sugar, you have no business taking that. Get rid of the sugar first and see if you still need it. If you still need it, I won't argue there. That's an open question. But if you're using sugar and GLP-1, you got a big problem, in my opinion. But I was arguing with my colleague about that, and he says, well, but some people, they're going to be malnourished because they're not going to. He didn't argue on the poverty side of things. He argued that some people would literally starve themselves to death if they weren't allowed to eat sugar, right? So, for example, he has a 6-year-old kid, and he argues that if he doesn't allow his 6-year-old kid to have dessert, he might just starve to death, and as if that's human nature. There was a time not that long ago when there was no such thing as refined white sugar. It had never been invented. In fact, today on this planet, there are places where there's still no refined white sugar. I don't seem to see an epidemic of those people being so unwilling to eat that they could starve to death, right? But these two people just really show how far people are going to push insanity just to sustain their addiction. It kind of reminds me of how some people talk when they're addicted to alcohol or nicotine, right? There are some people who probably believe that they would die if they didn't have their cigarettes and alcohol, right? For example, I had a roommate who was an alcoholic. He convinced me so much that at the time I was willing to believe maybe he wasn't an alcoholic. And the reason I believed he might not be an alcoholic was that he was able to not drink if he knew he had to drive or if he had to do anything that was dangerous. For example, I was showing him how to make bismuth crystals, and I told him I'll only do it with him if he agrees to not drink because this is too dangerous. And he spent the whole day without drinking. Sometimes he has to drive somewhere. I think he takes his bicycle to work, but occasionally he has to drive a car, and he'll know not to drink before doing it. So I thought he had it under control, but I've since learned that even people who can control their drinking before a dangerous activity, they could be classified as alcoholics. But he told me that he comes from a long family background of drinking, and it's not a big deal. He has the genes for it. And he told me that his father told him to never trust a man that you couldn't have a drink with, something to that effect. And so now looking back at it, that sounds very similar to how these two idiots, I might say, commented about the concept of soda and sugar and all the other crap that's in our food, right? This is the Peter Dislike Show. Bum 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 bum.